Noel Latif, President of the Foreign Policy Association. I'm delighted to welcome you to this centennial lecture in FPA's centenary year. Our topic this evening could not be more important, nor our speaker more qualified to address it. Some of you in this room will recall that Ambassador David Malone spoke to us on the eve of the Iraq War. His remarks then were incisive and prescient. This evening, Dr. Malone will speak on the topic of the UN Security Council, having co-edited a book entitled The UN Security Council in the 21st Century, as well as a book entitled Law and Practice of the United Nations. Prior to his current appointment as Rector of the United Nations University in Tokyo, Ambassador Malone served as President of Canada's International Development Research Centre. His earlier appointments include serving as Canada's permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as Canada's High Commissioner to India. From 1998 to 2004, he was president of the International Peace Academy, now the International Peace Institute. We are honored to have with us this evening to share with us his reflections on the UN Security Council, Ambassador David Malone. David?
Thank you all very much. I hope I won't rattle on for too long because I'm very much looking forward to hearing what aspect of the topic you're most interested in when we have an exchange a little bit later. Noel, thank you very much. Also to Cole Kitchen, who helped organize me to be here tonight, and my colleague Anthony Dursey, also, who's with me this evening. I think one thing that is important to remember is how relatively aged the multilateral system is, the system of organizations involving the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and related international institutions. They're over 70 years old. And that's a very long time in international relations, in history. The League of Nations, which largely failed in its mission ultimately, lasted really less than 20 years. So what we have is an aging system, a bit sclerotic, with a really important mission still in a variety of fields, but having trouble updating itself. And that is at the heart of some of the tensions surrounding the UN Security Council, which was largely set as an architecture in the run-up to 1945. Many of you will know that one of the first things that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill did during the Second World War and had been discussing even before the United States joined the war effort was how to design an international political and security body that would be more effective than the League of Nations. And they had already started in their speeches referring to the Allied group and other states who weren't aligned with the Axis as the United Nations. So the term didn't actually issue forth in 1945 in San Francisco. Routinely, Roosevelt and Churchill had been using it during much of the Second World War as the hoped-for organization which would prevent another world war. Both men having experienced 2 world wars, of course, were very preoccupied with conflict prevention, which is one of the themes this year, Noel was telling me, in the programming of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted it is. It was the great preoccupation, other than winning the war, of Roosevelt and Churchill. And the system they put in place was different from the League of Nations in several respects. First of all, it took economic cooperation very seriously. And the Bretton Woods Conference actually took place before the San Francisco Conference creating the UN. The Bretton Woods Conference created the International Monetary Fund and what was to become the World Bank. And a trade organization was the International Trade Organization. It was to be, and never became, was also envisaged at the time. The UN followed those because the analysis of the key allies was that what had caused the Second World War was economic mismanagement after the First World War, and also economic vengefulness of the victorious powers in 1919, 1920 over the defeated powers. And both Roosevelt and Churchill were determined not to repeat those mistakes. They also wanted the UN to have more teeth than the League of Nations. On paper, the League of Nations Charter looks pretty convincing, but actually it was not able to bring the United States in or to keep a number of its key member states in the early 1930s when nationalism started rising very strongly in their countries. Actually, it started in Italy a bit earlier. So the idea was to have a security organ of the UN that would have unique powers in international law, the power to authorize the use of force. This had not been envisaged as a multilateral legal function in any previous international architecture. And Roosevelt and Churchill were determined that this step should be taken in order to have the capacity to contain conflict if it was not actually prevented by the Security Council. So these are some of the continuum of history through the 20th century that led to a United Nations with more powers than any previous multilateral organization in the hope that conflict would be prevented. Unfortunately, as we know, within 3 years of the creation of the UN, the Cold War had broken out, and it did circumscribe considerably the effectiveness of the UN in the security sphere until the Cold War essentially burned itself out in the late 1980s. And there was a brief period in the early 1990s when it looked as if the Charter of the UN could be fully implemented for the first time. Unfortunately, disagreements between the major powers started emerging over that fateful country, Iraq, rather quickly. As early as 1994, I remember a British colleague telling me at the UN that we'd already blown the post-Cold War moment because neither Britain nor the United States were listening attentively enough to Russia and France, who were objecting to the rather maximalist position of Britain and the United States in terms of disarming Iraq and essentially directing its internal affairs from abroad. So a very brief period of post-Cold War euphoria during which a great deal did get done. And the most important event was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, completely unprovoked, clearly for its oil wealth, in 1990. Uniting around a very clever coalition-building strategy designed by Jim Baker, then Secretary of State, at the UN by a terrific American ambassador, Tom Pickering, with President Bush, who had been, the first President Bush, who had been ambassador at the UN and knew how the instrument could be used. The invasion of Kuwait was rapidly reversed in fully legal manner because the reversal and the use of force, limited force, it has to be said, was authorized by the Security Council. Now, what happened after this brief period of possibility during which the Security Council tried a lot and achieved quite a bit? Where are we today? First of all, as I mentioned, relationships in the Council amongst the key powers soured fairly quickly. I think the Western countries, but particularly Britain and the United States, were feeling euphoric and heedless of others. The French, interestingly, for a NATO country, sided with the Russians on Iraq, feeling that the United States and Britain were overreaching. In that, they proved to be right, as we all know from subsequent history involving Iraq. And so the Council worried its way through a number of subsequent crises and a number of subsequent episodes on Iraq with growing difficulty over the years. And today we have a council that is in agreement more than the newspapers would have us believe, because by and large the newspapers sell on bad news or outlandish news rather than boring good news. The good news is the Security Council is able to agree about 90% of the time on the very murderous conflicts raging in Africa today. So on Africa, the Security Council often takes its cue from the African Union on what strategy might work, but 90% of the time, the 5 countries that can veto any decision in the Council are able to agree quite easily. In fact, the role the African Union plays in often recommending a course of action is helpful, because none of the 5 want to offend Africa's regional organization. So that's something that isn't covered by the media very much, but is a very important dynamic in the Security Council. It's the only region of the world that the Council pays any attention to as a region when it expresses itself as such through the African Union. So it is able to agree much of the time on those conflicts, but as we see today in other conflicts, notably those of the Middle East, which are in the news a good deal, there is no agreement in the Council, and particularly on Syria, there have been very stark disagreements. I think also on Yemen, there's a great deal of relatively quiet disagreement with the approach of some of the Security Council powers. Now, what are the issues that unite all of the 5 permanent members? Quick reminder, those countries are the United States, China, the Russian Federation, Britain, and France. Quite diverse countries that have quite different interests and with a shifting balance of power amongst them over the last 25 years. What unites them is the fear of terrorism. All governments fear terrorism. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, was struck by an outlandish terrorist act in 1991 that nobody expected, precisely because the United States was the most powerful country in the world. Sorry, in 2001, not 1991. That unites the Council, but also often leads the Council to take decisions on terrorism that are not always well thought through. The Council is more fearful of terrorism and more inclined to combat it than it is driven to well thought through strategies. So several times the Council has overreached on terrorism, suffered the embarrassment of being rebuked by the European Union's court, the European Court of Justice, a long-fought case on a lack of due process in the Security Council's decisions on sanctions. Great embarrassment to the Council, which kept always feeling all-powerful, to discover that actually court opinions could matter in distant places, and then quietly had to find face-saving ways of complying, actually, with the decision of the European Court, because the European members were bound by the decision of that court. So that was a bit of a shock for the Security Council some years ago in the fight against terrorism, to discover there are judicial limits to what individual countries can do, but also what can be done collectively by groups of members of the UN. A second, rather contradictory in a way, impulse that does unite the 5 is something we might describe as the humanitarian imperative. And in this, the 5 are very much influenced by media coverage. So if there is dire distress in a distant land and there is considerable media coverage, the Council will feel impelled to take action of some form, to either try sincerely to bring the suffering to an end or to lessen it, or to pretend to. In the case of Yemen, there's been all too little media coverage, so the huge suffering unfolding in that country goes largely unaddressed, and Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, speaks of Yemen very often, but very few world leaders do. And in this country, hardly anybody does. Indeed, there seems to be a sense of shame about national policies with respect to Yemen, perhaps very appropriately so. So those two issues are uniters in the Council: terrorism, humanitarian distress. But that leaves many issues on which the Permanent 5 are disunited, and also with a growing number of strong leaders, so-called, essentially nationalist, populist leaders, being elected around the world. we have these strong figures increasingly bumping into each other. Think of Turkey and Saudi Arabia in the news just now. But there are plenty of other examples of how these figures who project themselves as strong often do so heedlessly of other figures who project themselves as strong. All of this being pregnant with risk, actually. And this should worry us all today, because leaders often back themselves into positions that their countries later have reasons to regret, bitter reasons to regret. Think back to the 1930s. And initially, those leaders are strongly supported in their countries. It's only when the costs of their policies are totaled up in war dead or economic distress that their bankruptcy is acknowledged within their countries. So we have a much more dangerous situation today. And the Security Council, in many ways, is ill-equipped to deal with some of the new tensions because the great powers have trouble uniting around a number of the critical issues. I'd say Syria has been the most blatant example, but it's far from the only one. What has been changing institutionally? A lot of it has been happening in slow motion. Some of it actually triggered by Security Council decisions. For example, the creation of international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, driven actually by the United States, both criminal tribunals, which led eventually, in fact rapidly by international standards, to an international criminal court, which is now opposed by the United States, which doesn't like the idea that it might be somehow subject to the court. So that's a slow-moving development in international relations that we can't fully assess yet. Will it be a busted flush? It could be. Many international initiatives that start hopefully wind up not working out. But this is one that is systemically important, because if over 20, 30, 40 years international criminal law starts being enforced seriously at the international level, that will be relevant to all of our countries. Secondly, we've seen a rise in the role of non-governmental organizations as actors in international relations. When I think back to when I was a young practitioner in the Middle East, there were NGOs active on the ground, notably religious groups who were very respected on both sides of the Israeli-Arab divide, the Mennonites, for example, and the Quakers. But by and large, NGOs were not major international actors. The provision of assistance by NGOs was not particularly political and hadn't reached the scale it's reached today. About 30 years ago, as the Cold War was ending, the more ambitious international NGOs in human rights, that would have been at the time Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, for example. In the development sphere, any number of them, but CARE, Save the Children, a number of others well known to you, all of a sudden saw an opportunity through their work to influence international decision-making. And so they started lobbying much more than they ever had before for outcomes on international decision-making that they thought were the right ones. And a great deal of this was more effective than it seemed, even at the United Nations, which is a rather hermetic organization in which the ambassadors live in a rather artificial world of their own. And I noticed about 15, 18 years ago, the key ambassadors in the Security Council were meeting with NGOs individually quite regularly. And I asked the Chinese ambassador, who was one of the first in a new generation of very modern Chinese diplomats, why he was meeting with NGOs. And he had a very interesting answer, a very obvious answer, but so obvious nobody else would have given it. He said, "I learned something." And that, again, was very insightful because NGOs know things that governments don't. Their incentive systems are different. Their perception is very different. Their value systems are different too. So NGOs have a different experience from government, and governments have quite a lot to gain in their international decision-making from listening to NGOs, which happens in Washington rather routinely with the major American NGOs, but had not been happening in the United States international personality previously. So NGOs have become more significant actors. My hope is that will last. Again, we don't know. If the world does take a more authoritarian turn, perhaps NGOs will be increasingly ignored because their advice is often inconvenient to governments, precisely because their perceptions are different from those of governments. So that's a major slow-moving change affecting the Security Council and many other international organizations. Certainly the European Union is under constant siege of NGOs. And finally, there has been growing pressure for change in international organizations. This relates to their age and their sclerotic character. After 70 years, they no longer fit very well with the world of today. And perhaps the powerful body in the world that fits least well with the realities of the world today is the Security Council. Its composition, with 5 permanent members selected in 1945, its very limited membership at the moment, with 11 rather disempowered elected members of the Council, is probably not what the UN needs. Now, the problem with reforming the Security Council, everybody talks about Security Council reform, is the current dispensation isn't ideal for any of the permanent members, but it's better than any alternative. So all 5 of the permanent members, each of which can veto reform of the Security Council, all 5 of them in fact oppose it. Some of them hypocritically claim publicly that they would favor it. They have done nothing to advance it if they do favor it. So we can assume in secret they don't. So this explains why there is no reform of the Security Council, and that is pregnant again with risk for the UN system, because to observers beyond the perimeter of the UN, all of this looks highly gamed, highly artificial, and suiting certain powers over the interests and weight of other powers. I used to live in India, as Noel mentioned, and from an Indian perspective, soon the most populous country of the world, country with a self-generated space program, a country with nuclear weapons, the idea that Britain is a permanent member and it is not rings somehow quite false. And a number of other countries, notably in the developing world, which is rapidly developing, contrary to what one might suppose, feel likewise. So this absence of reform of the Security Council is actually gnawing at the credibility of the whole organization. Other things also gnaw at the credibility of the organization, but nothing more so than when the Security Council is ineffective in maintaining the global peace, the ineffectiveness of the Council at times, and a sense that the institution is increasingly remote from publics, and it is more remote physically, partly because of the threat of terrorism against various UN targets, and partly because this more noisy and quarrelsome world we seem to be heading into is much more resistant to the gentle appeals of cooperation for peace, cooperation for development. A bit like the internet, it's all about me, me, me. I'm going to stop there and invite any of you with comments or questions to please go ahead. Noel.
David, well, thank you for those very penetrating insights. Can you comment on whether you see any possibility in the future of some reform of the veto in the Security Council?
I think not, and I'll tell you why. I think if the membership were able to agree at some point on new permanent members of the Security Council, it's unlikely the membership could agree to extend the veto to them. Smaller countries and middle powers see nothing positive in the veto. They don't have it, and they don't see why other, often more bullying powers should benefit from the veto. So I think the veto is unlikely to be reformed. Those of you with an interest in the emergence of the international system after the Second World War will know that President Roosevelt worried a great deal, knowing a lot about American history himself, that the US Congress, the Senate specifically, might reject US participation in the UN as it had rejected participation in the League of Nations if the US did not have blocking power. So the veto actually originated with the US. It wasn't being demanded by any other power. And it was only when the US demanded it that Stalin, feeling that in effect, through the death toll in Russia, the incredible fighting of the Soviet army, had won the Second World War, he didn't feel he could do without a veto. And then vetoes started being parceled out to some others. So I fear no, there will be no reform of the veto. And that, of course, is a long-term threat to the United Nations because the veto is bitterly resented by other countries. Please, ma'am, and then sir.
Captain Murray, I'm just very interested in...
Microphone's coming towards you.
Thank you. Thank you for the comments. I'd be interested in your impressions or your life as the UNU rector.
Mm-hmm.
So, any comments about the importance of the university?
Thank you. Well, I'd be delighted to give you a brief answer because I could knock on about it for a while. It was created, first of all, as a result of the reflection of a very thoughtful UN Secretary General, U Thant scholar himself, about the UN's trouble acquiring knowledge, respecting it, using it. So he thought an institution inside the UN dedicated to the academic strand of knowledge would be helpful. And it started up about 45 years ago. We're headquartered in Japan, but present in 15 locations around the world. On a relatively small scale, but with a very distinctive personality within the UN. First of all, we benefit from academic freedom. Nobody else does in the UN. Secondly, our economic model, our business model, so to speak, is completely different. We have a good size endowment, rather like American universities, although not on the scale of some of them. And we raise the rest ourselves. We don't take money from the member states, and we don't take instructions from the member states. And when they pitch up with their ideas, I tell them we're very interested in their ideas, and then we act on them or we don't. So it's an odd bird within the UN system. We've focused mostly on development challenges, including at the moment quite a lot of work on climate change. But we host one of the leading global institutions on development economics and also the founding institution on the economics of innovation. So it's quite varied, and it makes daily life for those of us working there fun. And I'm very grateful to you for asking about it. Thank you. Sir, you had a question over here.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your very interesting intervention. I would just like to come back to your mention to the like-mindedness of some Security Council members, namely the US, the UK, and to some extent France, who form the so-called P3. And you also mentioned the rise of authoritarianism, of populism, which also affects those countries with the election of President Trump or the decision to go for Brexit in the UK. So I was just wondering what, in your view, is going to be the effect on the unity of the P3? Thank you.
Well, I think the unity of the P3, as you mentioned, will inevitably be damaged by Brexit if it occurs. That being said, France and Britain have a strong defense relationship that is favored by the European Union identity of both, but I suspect will probably continue even if Brexit occurs. But what will happen, and I regret it, is that Britain will emerge a reduced international actor. This is something that doesn't seem to matter at all to the Brexiteers, but I think nobody who observes the international scene and cares about Britain thinks that somehow Britain will emerge enhanced. Nor will the European Union, which I greatly admire as the most optimistic project of the post-Second World War era, and in many ways the model for the African Union, which I mentioned earlier. The European Union will not emerge strengthened either. It will lose one of its strongest members, and a member that brought a distinctiveness of outlook, philosophy, capacity to the European Union that will be missed, I'm sure. So it's one of these train wrecks where everybody loses and nobody wins. So in the UN, I think France, Britain, often the United States will be like-minded. But I did point out that at times, China, Russia, and France have been like-minded and opposed to Britain and the United States. So it can be quite fluid. It depends on the issue, and it also depends on the diplomatic skill of the actors involved. I mentioned how very skilled the United States was in 1990 at the time of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. There was an extraordinarily experienced and creative team in Washington and also locally here at the UN. Subsequently, during several Iraq episodes, we had frankly, less accomplished American teams, and the results for the US as well as for the world were very bad indeed. So skill, professionalism, all of these things that are derided as elitist are actually quite important in the conduct of international relations. Please, in the back, there are a number of you, which is great. Please, go ahead, and then we'll have the lady in the back row, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. My question would be, you mentioned before that Mr. Guterres expressed the crisis in Yemen, but there has been so little coverage. So my question would be, why do you think this has been happening, and why it's been almost 4 years, if I'm not mistaken, that this is going on and there hasn't been much positive changes?
You're right, there has been much less media coverage than one would like. Occasionally the New York Times or the Financial Times will publish a very good article, but by and large it's a coverage orphan. The reason for this is twofold. Media organizations have a lot less money than they used to. Even the most powerful newspapers, nationally and internationally, have fewer resources, fewer correspondents, fewer foreign correspondents particularly, and many of their countries are more internally focused than they used to be and less externally focused. As against that, there is much better coverage in the Arab world than there used to be, because there are several pan-Arab news networks that are followed all over the Arab world, and also foreign television news is followed, non-Arab television news is followed quite a bit in the Arab world as well. So Yemen is more prominent in the Middle East than it seems to us when we're in the US or in my case, when I'm living in Japan. Secondly, I think there's a sort of humanitarian fatigue, just one bad situation after another. What's to be done? We'd rather be playing tic-tac-toe. And that is very human. It's unfortunate, but it's human. And again, it's very much induced by the internet. When you can waste your time all day long, serious issues are going to recede. And that's what's been happening in slow motion for about 20 years. So while the internet has brought great benefits, particularly to poor countries, I'd say it's devastated the attention span in rich countries. Ma'am.
Above all, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. I would like to ask two questions. The first one is, what can the states learn from NGOs, because you mentioned it? And the second one is, when and how will the International Criminal Court judgments or decisions be seriously enforced? Thank you.
Great. Well, on your first question, I'll give you a specific example. At the time trouble was breaking out in Rwanda in 1994, there was very little media coverage of Rwanda at the time, and one of the permanent members, controversially, seems to have been involved actively or passively in the trouble, and another permanent member seemed to be ignoring rather deliberately what was happening on the ground. The council was chaired at the time by New Zealand's ambassador, a lawyer called Colin Keating, was later the founder of an NGO called Security Council Report, which documents the work of the Security Council. And he shamed the council by bringing in information from the NGOs on the ground. And it was that information that forced France and the United States to start paying more positive attention. It was NGO-driven and curated information, which turned out to be accurate. So I think NGOs, as I say, are often have a different stream of knowledge, and in particular, they're often on the ground in conflict countries in a different way from foreign governments or international organizations. They're closer, perhaps, to the grassroots of conflicts, if one can express it that way. As to the International Criminal Court, I'd love to be optimistic about the court. I'm a big supporter of the court. I think the jury is still out on whether governments are willing to enforce the judgments of the court. I think the court made some mistakes early on. It was clearly a mistake to select nothing but cases from Africa. African governments took deep offense to that. So mistakes were made, but I'd say the bigger problem today is the attitude of governments who don't like having courts domestically, and certainly like having courts internationally even less. So I wish I could be more optimistic, but I can't. One last one quickly, and that will be it. Please, ma'am, go ahead. Here. The microphone's coming to you. And I'll have to be very brief in response. I apologize.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Malone, for those insights. I have a question regarding what you mentioned in the beginning and the judicial challenges to anti-terrorism sanctions by the UN Security Council, as a result of which, as you know, the ombudsperson position was established and integrated in some of the sanctions regime. And I was just wondering if you think that if this is enough from human rights and due process perspective, and if we can hope for some proper judicial review mechanism in that respect. Thank you.
Just a sentence of explanation. After this embarrassing episode I mentioned, the Security Council was looking for some face-saving way of lifting sanctions on many of the arbitrarily sanctioned individuals. And as you were pointing out, tolerated the creation by the Secretary General of an ombudsperson who promptly recommended 90% of those sanctioned be desanctioned, which was done, by the way. Nobody apologized for a thing, I should add. Governments aren't used to apologizing for any of their bad decisions. So it was hopeful, but it's also important to see it as a decision taken in a moment of acute embarrassment, rather than a forward-looking decision by visionary governments or ambassadors. Thank you very much.